So, Sean McDowell just devoted his latest YouTube video to interviewing a gentleman who is a scientist talking about how there are documented cases of human beings being swallowed by big fish or whales and surviving. And therefore, I guess we can have confidence in the conservative evangelicals' interpretation of the book of Jonah. Let's begin with the opening sequence, and then I'll offer my own thoughts.
I'm so curious, are there legitimate, like modern examples of people who have survived in a whale?
There was a lobster fisherman off the coast of Cape Cod who was diving, and he was actually fully swallowed by a humpback whale, was entirely within the mouth of the whale. He reports that it was dark. He was fully enclosed. Once the boat was on the bottom of the ocean, he had no way to get out of the room for 3 days before he was rescued. Yes, the story tells us very powerfully that God is faithful to his promises, and he will accomplish his promises regardless of whatever obstacles may exist in our lives on earth, and he accomplishes his purposes in history and also in our individual lives.
Could Jonah have really survived 3 days in the belly of the whale or the big fish? Critics have often claimed that it is scientifically impossible. The story is a myth, and thus the Bible is unreliable. Here to offer a different perspective is Dr. William Cheshire, a professor of neurology. He holds an AB in biochemical sciences from Princeton University.
Okay, we can stop right there. I think we get the idea of what this is about. So, a professor of neurology, not an expert in, is there a subcategory of science that studies big fish swallowing people? I don't know. But if there is, he's not, I take it, an expert in that. Honestly, there are just a couple huge problems with this whole conversation. The first problem is McDowell sets up the conversation at the outset by saying these are your options. Either the story is quote unquote myth, or it happened just as written in history. And keep in mind here that for McDowell, for well, for the typical audience member who's going to watch this, when they hear myth, they mean false. They interpret that as just meaning false. They don't interpret it in the technical sense of myth as a story that conveys a universal truth or an etiological account of some notion of origins or something. Rather, they understand myth to be just something that is false. And so McDowell has set up for the viewer a binary. Either you accept that the story is just false and the Bible is not inspired and has no authority, or you accept that in fact a human being was swallowed by a big fish or by a whale. And of course, that's a false and harmful binary. The story of Jonah, there are many reasons that you would take that as a parabolic, non historical story in its literary context. So, and that's not as anti-supernatural bias, which is what I was told growing up as a fundamentalist or fundagelical in the 1980s, that it was people who had an anti-supernatural bias who would question the historicity of the story of Jonah and the big fish or the whale, when in fact it need not be that at all. But the second piece here, and I'll just say maybe one more thing. So this is just another case of evangelicals majoring on minors. They treat a commitment to the historicity of the entire biblical narrative straight through from the creation and fall in the garden to the book of Acts and on to the events of Revelation. That all has to be interpreted as a historical and then future narrative of events that have happened, are happening, and will happen. And if you question any of that, you're really undermining the entire gospel, which turns the gospel into some sort of Jenga tower. When in fact, the gospel is based not on a Jenga tower of various historical claims extending back to a historical garden and fall, but rather is centered on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus historically. That's what the gospel is all about. And when people focus, like McDowell, focus on defending the historicity of the Jonah narrative, over against skeptics, atheists who are rejected as myth. They set up an unfair binary, an unhelpful binary that really distorts the content and significance of what the gospel itself is. And then you end up spending often as much time defending the historicity of Jonah being swallowed by the whale or allegedly an ark being found on top of Mount Ararat as you spend looking at the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So misappropriated resources and misbegotten valuations of various claims. Now, the second thing I wanted to say, oh, sorry, one of my dogs is biting my sock off my foot. The other thing I wanted to say is there's also something really ironic about this whole thing. So I guess I haven't, I'll admit at the outset, I've only watched the first minute of this video. I'm not interested in watching a professor of neurology argue for a historical reading of Jonah because I don't think that's what that text is about. I think that's missing the point of what it's about. I think it is a misappropriation of resources. But there's also something really interesting here, and that is that they they feel, and again, McDowell set this up, that you have to defend the narratives against science or against scientific skepticism. When the whole point of the narrative, if anything, is that this is miraculous, is that God intervened in space-time history to save Jonah because he had a purpose for him, which Jonah was trying to escape and avoid. And so God threw him in the water, put him into the fish, brought him back to land, go save the Ninevites. And he had to do that. It's to feel like you have to defend this as a scientific claim by finding modern purported examples of people being swallowed by whales and surviving is just to miss the entire point. It's kind of like saying, well, so the Bible says that an axe head floated in water, and I know that that appears to be impossible with science, but there were documented cases in the Georgian Republic in the 1920s of axe heads floating, and it is possible because of the high saline content of the water, and go on and on and on. Whether those are true stories or not, that's missing the point. These are supernatural events, and that's their power in the narrative. So, on these 2 points, I just find this to be baffling. Now, the interesting thing is McDowell often presents himself as a winsome, progressive, I'm not going to say progressive, but a winsome, academically engaged evangelical teaching at Biola, one of the flagship academic institutions of conservative evangelicalism, although that could change because now Alyssa Childers has turned her sights onto Biola and is claiming that it is, I guess, in fact, a bad place to send your conservative evangelical children. But McDowell has always presented himself as that, as not a fundamentalist. And yet, time and again, when you look at his content, a lot of it is very much fundamentalist in orientation. And this is just another example.